On the morning of May 27, 1980, at exactly 4 a.m., 5 divisions of the South Korean Army rolled into the city of Gwangju with tanks, armored vehicles, and paratroopers disguised in unmarked uniforms. Their insignias stripped, their helmets covered in leaf camouflage with white bands to identify each other in the dark. Their mission had an official name. The military called it Operation Sangmu Chungjong. Its target was not an enemy army. Its target was not a foreign invader. Its target was a city of 800,000 South Korean citizens who had committed a crime so dangerous that the government deployed 3 airborne brigades to stop it. Their crime was asking for democracy, and for 10 days they had won. This is the story of Gwangju, the massacre that South Korea tried to erase from its own history. To understand what happened inside that city, you have to understand what happened 6 months before it. On October 26, 1979, Park Chung-hee, the military dictator who had ruled South Korea with an iron fist for 18 years, was assassinated by his own intelligence chief during a private dinner. The bullet ended one dictatorship, but the power vacuum it created gave birth to another. Within weeks, a brigadier general named Chun Do-hwan seized control of the South Korean military through an internal coup on December 12th. Chun was methodical. By April of 1980, he had maneuvered himself into the position of chief of the Korean Central Intelligence Agency. By early May, the country was experiencing what Koreans would later call the Seoul Spring, a brief window of hope where students returned to campuses, professors spoke openly, and opposition politicians began organizing for democratic elections. For a few weeks, South Korea breathed. Chun ended that breath on May 17th. On that day, he forced the cabinet to expand martial law to the entire country. Every university was shut down. All political activities were banned. The press was placed under direct military control, and 26 politicians were arrested, including Kim Dae-jung, the most prominent opposition leader in the country, a man who had been born just outside of Gwangju and had built his political base in the Jeolla region. Kim was charged with instigating protests that hadn't even happened yet. Then Chun did something that would define the next 10 days and the next 46 years of Korean history. He sent paratroopers to Gwangju. The soldiers arrived at Chonam National University on the morning of May 18th. About 600 students had gathered at the university gate to protest the closure of their school. 30 paratroopers faced them. By 9:30 a.m., the two sides clashed. The soldiers charged with batons. The students threw stones. But what happened next was not a response to stone throwing. The paratroopers, elite troops from the special forces, trained for assault missions, began beating anyone they could find. Not just students, anyone on the street. They used rifle butts, bayonets and clubs. They kicked people on the ground. They chased them into alleys. By the end of that first day, 2 people were dead and scores were injured. But the violence did not pacify Gwangju. It ignited it. On May 19th, the city erupted. Workers left their shops. Parents ran into the streets to find their children. Market vendors, many of them middle-aged women, began organizing. By the 20th, the protests had grown from hundreds to tens of thousands. Shopkeepers, taxi drivers, bus drivers, teachers, factory workers, high school students, the entire social fabric of Gwangju mobilized. The regime responded by escalating. According to eyewitness accounts compiled in the May 18 archives, soldiers fired tear gas, then rubber bullets, then live ammunition into crowds of unarmed civilians. On May 21st, the bloodshed reached a point of no return. Soldiers opened fire on demonstrators near the Jeollanam-do provincial office, the seat of regional government that would become the symbolic heart of the uprising. Dozens fell. Blood ran in the streets around the fountain where just 3 days earlier, students had been chanting for elections. And then something happened that the military had not anticipated. The citizens fought back. Residents raided a local armory and seized weapons. Taxi drivers and bus drivers organized convoys. They drove buses, garbage trucks, and private cars at military positions. The city's population, ordinary people with no military training, engaged the most powerful army in the country in open combat. And by the evening of May 21st, the unthinkable had occurred. The military retreated. Every soldier, every paratrooper, every tank pulled back to the outskirts of the city. Gwangju was free. For 6 days, from May 21st to May 26th, the citizens of Gwangju governed themselves. And what they built in those 6 days destroyed the regime's entire propaganda narrative more effectively than any weapon ever could. Because Chun Doo-hwan's government had told the rest of South Korea, through every newspaper, every television broadcast, every radio station it controlled, that Gwangju had descended into anarchy. The official story was that communist agitators, directed by North Korea, had taken over the city and were terrorizing its population. The government used the word rioters. It used the word thugs. It used the word insurrection. State media painted a picture of chaos, looting, and lawless violence. The reality inside Gwangju was the opposite. Citizens formed 2 governing bodies. The Citizens Settlement Committee, composed of about 20 religious leaders, lawyers, and professors, negotiated with the military, demanding the release of arrested citizens and compensation for victims. The Student Settlement Committee, made up of university students joined by trade unionists and ordinary citizens, organized funerals for the dead, set up traffic control, managed food distribution, and coordinated medical aid. Market vendors used a traditional Korean system of pooling resources called jae to establish communal kitchens that fed the militia and protesters. The Cheonam National University Hospital operated as a field hospital throughout the 10 days. Its medical records, later compiled in a dedicated volume, documented the scale of injuries with clinical precision. There were no reports of looting, no reports of random violence, no reports of score settling. For 6 days, a city of 800,000 people, traumatized by military violence, organized itself with a discipline and solidarity that stunned the foreign journalists who managed to enter. And this is where Gwangju's story intersects with a German cameraman and a taxi driver. Jürgen Hinspeter was a reporter for the ARD, the German Public Broadcasting Network. On May 19th, a pastor from the East Asia Germany mission arranged for him to travel from Japan to South Korea. In the early morning hours of May 20th, Hinspeter entered Gwangju covertly, a city the military had sealed off from the rest of the country by cutting every phone line, blocking every road, and jamming every communication channel. He got in with the help of a taxi driver named Kim Sa-bok, who drove him from Seoul into the besieged city. Hinspeter filmed everything. He recorded soldiers beating young people in the streets. He recorded bodies in the provincial government building. He shot 10 rolls of film over several days. And then he faced the problem of getting that film out of a city under total military lockdown. He hid the 5 most critical rolls on his body. The other 5 he placed in a metal biscuit tin that he decorated to look like a wedding gift. He flew to Tokyo. And on May 22, 1980, his footage was broadcast on the evening news across all of West Germany through the Tagesschau, the country's most watched news program. That broadcast was the first time the outside world saw what was happening in Gwangju. Inside South Korea, the population knew nothing. The censorship was total. But in newsrooms in Germany, then across Europe, then in the United States, the footage of South Korean soldiers attacking South Korean civilians shattered any illusion that Chun Doo-hwan's regime was a legitimate government-maintaining order. Kim Sa-bok, the taxi driver who made that footage possible, died of liver cancer in 1984. He was 54 years old. Because the Gwangju Uprising had not been officially acknowledged during his lifetime, nobody knew who he was. Hinspeter searched for him for years and never found him. The journalist received a major Korean press award in 2003 and in his acceptance speech credited the driver by name. It was only in 2017, after a blockbuster Korean film called A Taxi Driver brought 12 million viewers to theaters, that Kim Sa-bok's son came forward and confirmed his father's identity. Hinspeter himself died in January 2016. He had once expressed his wish to be buried in Gwangju. But back in May of 1980, while Hinspeter's footage was traveling to Tokyo, the liberated city of Gwangju was running out of time. Inside the provincial office, a 29-year-old man had emerged as the de facto leader of the resistance. His name was Yoon Sang-won. Born on August 19, 1950, in Gwangssan District, Gwangju, Yoon had attended Chonam National University in the 1970s and then taken a job at a bank. But in 1978, driven by his opposition to the Park Chung-hee dictatorship, he quit banking to dedicate himself to labor organizing. He ran a night school for workers called Wildfire, located in the heart of Gwangju's industrial area. On May 1st, 1980, just 17 days before the uprising, he had helped form the National Democratic Workers' League. When the massacre began, Yoon did not pick up a weapon first. He picked up a pen. He organized a collective of his night school students and teachers to produce a single-page newspaper called The Militants' Bulletin. They published 10 issues. In a city cut off from every media source, where the only information available was the military's lies broadcast on controlled radio, Yoon's newspaper became the voice of truth. Its second issue, dated May 22nd, urged citizens to gather in their districts and march toward the provincial office. Its circulation gave the resistance both information and purpose. By May 25th, Yoon had become the spokesperson of the newly formed Democratic Struggle Committee. He held press conferences with the few foreign correspondents who had reached the city. According to the account of journalist Bradley Martin, then the Tokyo bureau chief of the Baltimore Sun, Yoon was the unnamed spokesman who held a press conference and focused his gaze on Martin as he made two requests. First, that the journalists convey to the American ambassador a request for U.S. mediation between the citizens and the government. Second, and this was the request that revealed what Yoon already knew, he explained what the militia would do when the military returned. They would fight. On May 25th, 50,000 people gathered for a rally in front of the provincial office. They adopted a resolution demanding the end of martial law and the release of Kim Dae-jung. Many citizens believed, with tragic naivety, that the United States would intervene on their behalf. After all, the U.S. maintained 40,000 troops in South Korea and held operational control over much of the Korean military. An American aircraft carrier was even repositioned near the peninsula during the crisis. Citizens interpreted it as a warning to Chun. It was not. According to declassified State Department documents, the Carter administration, already reeling from the Iranian hostage crisis, made a calculated decision to avoid another crisis in Asia. American officials urged restraint on both sides, but ultimately gave the South Korean military the green light to redeploy troops to retake the city. The aircraft carrier was not there to protect Gwangju. It was there to watch. By May 26th, the army had massed outside the city and was ready to move. Members of the Citizens' Settlement Committee made one last attempt to prevent bloodshed. They lay down in the streets to block the army's advance. It did not work. Inside the provincial office, the final hours were defined by a bitter division. Moderates on the Settlement Committee argued for returning weapons and surrendering to prevent further deaths. Yoon Sang-won and the militants argued that surrender without conditions would betray everything the dead had fought for. According to Korean sources documenting that night, at 6 p.m. on May 26th, When a significant faction pushed for disarmament, Yun and the Situation Room director drew pistols and refused to allow the weapons to be returned. The moderates left the building at 9 p.m. Those who stayed knew what was coming. On the evening of May 26th, with the army's attack hours away, Yun Sang-won spoke to the remaining militia members and to the foreign journalists present. The words attributed to him in multiple accounts, including Martin's, conveyed a single message. They expected to lose today, but believed that history would vindicate them. At 4 a.m. on May 27th, Operation Sangmu Chungjong launched. 3 airborne brigades, the 3rd, 7th, and 11th, moved into downtown Gwangju in unmarked uniforms. They carried M16A1 rifles and stun grenades. The operation was designed for speed and overwhelming force. Within 90 minutes, the provincial office fell. The civil militias were defeated. Yun Sang-won was killed during the assault. His body was found with third-degree burns, head trauma, and stab wounds, damage so severe that his own family could not recognize him when they retrieved the body on June 22nd. He was 29 years old. He was buried in Mangwol-dong Cemetery, coffin number 57, grave number 111. In his shirt pocket, according to the account of journalist Bradley Martin, was the business card of a New York Times correspondent, as if in his final moments he had been caught between two irreconcilable acts, fighting and trying to make sure someone would tell the story. The military arrested 1,740 people after retaking the city. 730 were detained for further investigation. And then the regime did what regimes do when the evidence of their crimes is overwhelming. It buried the story. Every phone line into and out of Gwangju remained cut. Every journalist who had been inside the city was tracked. The military government released an official death toll of 191, comprising 164 civilians, 23 soldiers, and 4 police officers. This number was enforced. Anyone who disputed it publicly was liable for arrest under the charge of spreading false rumors. But the city of Gwangju knew. The families who went to Mangwol-dong Cemetery and found their children's bodies knew. The doctors at Cheonam National University Hospital who had treated hundreds of gunshot wounds knew. The market vendors who had cooked rice for the militia knew. The gap between the official count and reality became one of the defining silences of South Korean history. Records of deaths in the city for May 1980 showed approximately 2,300 more than the historical average. Academic estimates, including those of Stanford historian Gi Wook-shin, place the actual death toll at over 1,000. Some estimates reach 2,000. The exact number remains unknown to this day, but the regime's suppression of the truth created a paradox it could not resolve. The harder Chun's government worked to erase Gwangju, the more powerful Gwangju became as a symbol. Throughout the 1980s, the memory of Gwangju fueled the Korean democracy movement underground. First-hand accounts were copied and passed from hand to hand. Hinspeter's footage was smuggled back into Korea and screened secretly in university clubrooms. In 1987, a student at Yonsei University, named Lee Han-yeol, organized underground screenings that helped radicalize a new generation. Gwangju became the word that could not be said in public, but that everyone whispered. The government's lie, that it had been a communist insurrection, collapsed under the weight of too many witnesses, too many families, and too many graves. In 1987, 7 years after the massacre, millions of South Koreans marched in cities across the country. This time, the regime could not stop them. The democracy movement of '87, directly catalyzed by the memory and methods of Gwangju, forced Chun's successor, Roh Tae-woo, to agree to direct presidential elections. South Korea's first truly democratic election followed. In 1988, the National Assembly held public hearings on Gwangju. The events were officially renamed from the government's dismissive label to the Gwangju Uprising, and later the Gwangju People's Uprising. The hearings included testimony from Kim Dae-jung himself, the man who had been arrested, tried by military tribunal, and sentenced to death for supposedly instigating the very protests he was in prison during. In 1995, the National Assembly passed the special law on the May 18th democratization movement, which enabled prosecution even though the statute of limitations had expired. On December 3, 1995, Chun Do-hwan and Roh Tae-woo, along with 15 others, were arrested. In 1996, Chun was convicted of mutiny and treason and sentenced to death. Roh received a lesser sentence. Both were pardoned in 1997, at the request of the incoming president, Kim Dae-jung. That sentence deserves a pause. The man who was sentenced to death for Gwangju, who was arrested on the same day the massacre began, who spent years in prison and exile, was elected president of South Korea in 1997. He became the first opposition candidate to win the presidency. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2000, and one of his first acts was to pardon the general who had tried to execute him. There is one more figure in this story who deserves to be remembered because his fate reveals how the machinery of state violence consumed even those who tried to resist it from within. Ahn Byung-ha was the Commissioner General of the Jeonnam Provincial Police, the highest-ranking police official in Gwangju when the massacre began. When Chun Do-hwan's martial law command ordered the police to open fire on civilians, Ahn refused. He would not give the order. For this act of conscience, he was immediately removed from his position. But that was not enough for the regime. Ahn was taken by the Army Counterintelligence Corps and tortured. The damage to his body from that torture contributed to his death 8 years later. The police commissioner who said no was destroyed. And some of the paratroopers, according to residents' testimony, actually chased and assaulted local police officers who had sided with the citizens. The military viewed even the police as enemies. In 2011, 31 years after the massacre, the documents of the Gwangju Uprising, 4,271 items comprising 858,900 pages, were inscribed on the UNESCO Memory of the World International Register. The inscription recognized them as human rights documentary heritage of global significance. Following the inscription, Gwangju established the May 18 archives as a permanent repository for written, oral, and filmed materials. In 2018, South Korea's Ministry of National Defense issued its first official apology for the massacre. Chun Do-hwan died on November 23, 2021, at the age of 90. He had published memoirs in which he denied any responsibility for the massacre and dismissed the uprising as a riot. He never apologized. In the years after his death, his grandson publicly visited Gwangju and apologized to the victims' families on behalf of the family, and then made a series of accusations of corruption against his own grandfather. Today, the former provincial office stands as the Center for Democracy and Peace Exchange. The fountain where students chanted in May 1980 is now the May 18th Democracy Plaza, Mangwol-dong Cemetery, where handcarts and garbage trucks carried 137 bodies in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, was elevated to the status of a national cemetery in 2002. And every year, on May 18th, survivors and bereaved families gather at Mangwol-dong. For decades, they were forbidden from singing a particular song together, a song called March for the Beloved, written to honor Yoon Sang-won and another activist, Park Gi-sun, in a symbolic posthumous wedding. Under conservative administrations, the song was excluded from the official ceremony. It was only in 2017, under President Moon Jae-in, that the participants were once again permitted to sing it. 89-year-old Lim Gun-dan, who still attends the memorials, has told interviewers about her 29-year-old son, a tailor with a newborn baby daughter, who was beaten to death by soldiers in May 1980. In Gwangju, the denial of the massacre remains a live political weapon. Far-right and conservative groups in South Korea continue to characterize the uprising as a North Korean-backed insurrection, a claim for which, in over 4 decades, zero evidence has been produced. The May 18th democratization movement. Truth Commission, launched in 2020 under special legislation, was tasked with uncovering the full truth about the use of military force, including whether helicopters fired on civilians, a claim supported by eyewitness testimony but not yet confirmed by the military. And the role of the United States remains, to this day, a source of unresolved anger. 40,000 American troops were stationed in South Korea in 1980. Under the terms of the Combined Forces Agreement, the U.S. held operational control over much of the Korean military. The Special Forces units used in Gwangju were technically outside that command structure, but declassified documents show that American officials were aware of troop movements and chose not to intervene. For many South Koreans, particularly those who lived through May of 1980, this remains an unhealed wound. At 4 a.m. on May 27th, 5 divisions moved into Gwangju with tanks and stripped insignias, and within 90 minutes they crushed a city that had governed itself in peace for 6 days. The government said 191 people died. The graves said otherwise. The files, 858,900 pages of them, said otherwise. And the man who led the last stand, a 29-year-old former banker who chose a printing press before he chose a pistol, died with a journalist's business card in his pocket because he understood in his final hours that the fight for Gwangju would not end with bullets. It would end with the truth. It took 7 years for the first democratic election, 8 years for the first public hearing, 15 years for the first prosecution, 31 years for UNESCO recognition, 38 years for the first military apology, and more than 40 years later, the count of the dead is still not finished. Gwangju was not hidden because the evidence was lacking. Gwangju was hidden because the evidence was overwhelming. And the people who ordered the killing controlled every microphone, every printing press, and every telephone line in the country. But they could not control a German cameraman with 10 rolls of film in a biscuit tin. They could not control a taxi driver who drove into a sealed city because it was the right thing to do. They could not control a police commissioner who said no and paid with his life. They could not control a 29-year-old spokesman who published 10 issues of a newspaper in a city the world had been told did not exist. And they could not control 858,900 pages of documents that refused to disappear. The first paratroopers arrived at Cheonam National University at 9:30 on the morning of May 18th, 1980, and beat 600 students with rifle butts and bayonets. 46 years later, the question Gwangju still asks is not whether it happened. The 858,000 pages settled that. The question is whether the world has finished counting the dead. Because the families at Mangwol-dong Cemetery, the mothers, the daughters, the widows, are still waiting for a number that matches the graves.